Hello, hello, Liberation Hour. Welcome back to the show. This is Comrade Felicity coming at you pre-recorded. Yes, I am currently out of town for the holidays, and so I pre-recorded this episode with Comrade Camilo on essentially it's Enver Part 2, but we're focusing more on Albanian policy and just Albanian anti-revisionism as a whole. This is a really important topic, and we're really excited to cover it for you guys today. And so, if you like it, go ahead, go on back to the YouTube channel at Comrade Felicity or Communist Bananas on YouTube. Give it a like, give it a comment. The full episode will be posted there. And happy holidays, folks. Whatever you celebrate, if you celebrate, and we'll see you in the next one. Okay. Yes. So welcome to the show, Comrade Camilo. We are back once again talking about Albania.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yes.
Oh, this is my third appearance. I should be asking for royalties, you know.
Yes, you should. Not that we're making any money off of this, but Comrade Camilo, as you all know, is for longtime listeners who've been here for the last few months, is the general secretary of the party, American Party of Labor.
Well, not the general secretary.
Not the
chair, the national chair.
The national chair,
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, the national chair, and is here to talk about, once again, Albania and Verhoja, their policies, and just going a little deeper than we did last time into this leader and anti-revisionism more specifically, because right now I think we are really experiencing in the communist movement a lot of rifts as it relates to revisionism.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. And it comes to the point where almost anti-revisionism is almost, not totally, but almost synonymous with Hoja and synonymous with Marxism-Leninism. Really, one of the most eye-opening things I've ever seen in my life was of all places, an extreme right-wing blog. In fact, it was a fascist blog. I don't know if it's still around, but it was called Stormfront, and it was like that's where all the fascists gathered in the early 2000s. And I remember that they were in some discussion about commies, and among the usual stuff, commies, pedophiles, are all N-words and F-words, but there was one or two intelligent fascists, which, by the way, is a dangerous beast. Dangerous beast. You don't want intelligent fascists, but there was one who was, and he said something like, because we're talking about the different tendencies, and he said Hojaism, and someone said, "Well, what's Hojaism?" And this fascist responded, "Marxism-Leninism," and then goes, "Unless you are a Maoist." If you're a Marxist-Leninist, whether you admit it to yourself or not, you're a Hojaist.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think a lot of people make the argument that Hojaism isn't a thing, which I would agree with in the sense that,
absolutely.
I've said it before, I believe, that Hojaism as its own ideology is not a thing. It very much is Marxism-Leninism. Hoja, the reason I believe we uphold Hoja at the American Party of Labor is because of his anti-revisionist work. And his dedication to being an anti-revisionist. Is that true?
Absolutely. Certainly.
Yeah. And I think that, there's a lot of questioning around, what is revisionism? Why is it antithetical to the Marxist approach? And I would say the main thing is, I've heard Richard Wolff explain it like this a lot, and I have a lot of problems with Richard Wolff, mainly because he's not a communist. He's more of like an anarchist. But he explains it, I think, kind of well, where there it's like you have your right wing. Would we consider it right deviationists who are reformists?
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, you could have revisionism from the right, which is what's most common and what's really prevalent in this country. But you could also have revisionism from the left.
That would be like anarchism.
Well, no, I wouldn't quite say anarchism, because anarchism, and there's a huge debate about this.
Okay.
Because some people say anarchism is a variant of socialism. I disagree with that. I think there's some commonalities there, certainly. There's a similar point of origin, because you could argue that both socialism and anarchism kind of come out of the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Um, but I think anarchism is its own thing.
I
That's
would
my
I
personal belief.
I would argue that as well, mainly because anarchism has like I would say I would call it a bit odd, like this very odd emphasis on the individual
Hmm.
and individual
Hmm.
liberties, which almost makes them more related to libertarians in some ways. Although any anarchist would get very mad if you called them a libertarian.
Well, they coined the term. The term libertarian originally was an anarchist term.
No way.
And when you
Oh.
talk to people outside of the US and use that word libertarian, they almost automatically assume anarchist.
Mm,
Except we have, as so often happens in the United States, all these terms get thrown around and
they
muddied,
do.
and because of the American Libertarian Party,
Yes,
so now that term libertarian has become a right-wing signifier, when
it
in fact
has.
that was typically not the case and still isn't the case outside of the US.
Yeah, and I would say it's definitely taken on a right-wing shift. But as it pertains to like Hoja and his upholding of anti-revisionism, this was coming at a time as just like a like kind of like not a history lesson, just like a context for the listener. Mao was still the leader of China at the time, I believe.
Mhm.
They had had
Yes.
their revolution, what, the 50s, 40s?
49. It was a long process. You could
Yeah.
even trace it back all the way to 1911. But
Mm,
the victory of the communist victory, the victory of the Communist Party of China was in 1949.
yes. And they went red. You also have Tito, who was coming up in
Mhm.
Yugoslavia. And then you have Albania, of course. And then there was at one point there was like a Greek revolution, I believe, going on that did not pan out.
Yes, the Greek Civil
And
War.
the Greek Civil War, and then there was also the Spanish Civil War that, of course, we got Franco. Um, but as pertains to Hoja, he was an interesting figure in his own right because, there was a lot of revisionism going on within the communist sphere of influence over in like Eastern Europe and, going out west. But, Hoja was doing something a little bit different than a lot of the other regimes. What was that exactly?
I think one of the things that needs to be pointed out about Albania specifically
Hmm.
was that, and it's kind of weird when you hear who their partner in this was. That if you look at the states of people's democracy, the so-called Eastern Bloc, the so-called Communist Bloc after World War II, um, there were only two that were the products of indigenous revolutionary struggles that liberated themselves from the Nazis, or the Nazis slash Italian fascists in the case of Albania, and
Hmm.
liberated themselves. One was Albania, the other was Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
The rest were established by the Red Army.
Yep. That's true. Yeah.
And
And
that doesn't invalidate them at all.
no, no.
But it does speak to there were some unique factors going on with Albania and Yugoslavia.
Yeah, there and what were those factors exactly?
Well, like I said, an indigenous revolution.
Yeah.
So it was a genuine mass uprising of the Albanian and Yugoslav peoples.
Yeah. And I would say my next big question, it was what is the difference between like a Tito and a Hoja?
Tito, and a lot of this becomes sort of evident only in hindsight.
Hmm.
Tito was a lot more of a nationalist,
It's true.
and I'm almost tempted to say a mini imperialist in his own right.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that immediately, one of the first things that caused everyone's eyebrows to rise about Tito was he wanted to create what he called a Balkan Federation.
Hmm.
that would have included all the republics of Yugoslavia, plus Albania and Bulgaria.
Okay.
And of course, the capital of this Balkan Federation was going to be Belgrade.
Yeah.
And the leader of this Balkan Federation was going to be Tito. But that was like maybe the first thing that caused everyone to go, wait, what's this guy really up about? What's this guy really doing?
Yeah. A Balkan Federation is an interesting choice to make and under a communist regime. That's a little odd. You wouldn't expect that.
No, not at all. And I think throughout his life, Tito demonstrated his, and it's funny because he himself was Croatian.
Hmm.
But I even remember back in the 80s, there were Croatian, Yugoslavia was still, existing at the time. There were Croatian nationalist groups that were committing acts of terrorism, wanting to break Croatia away from Yugoslavia.
Right.
And we're always blaming Tito and the Yugoslav regime to such an extent that I remember seeing a humorous comment somewhere. How many Croatian terrorists does it take to turn out a light bulb? And it was one to blow it out with a shotgun, and 250 to write letters to the New York Times blaming it on Tito.
So awesome. That's so funny.
But even though he himself was Croatian, politically, he kind of aligned a lot more with Serbian nationalism. And
That's what I
certainly
heard.
that's certainly how he was seen.
Yeah, and so, and there's one thing that a friend of mine, we were talking on the phone one night, and we were talking about communism, of course. What else would we talk about? And he was like, not Hoja, Tito was friends with everyone. At his funeral,
Yeah,
you had
yeah.
Margaret Thatcher,
Hmm.
you had, which insane, by the way, Ronald Reagan,
Hmm.
you had Mao.
Yes.
No, wait, Mao
Yeah,
was
yeah,
there. Mao
yeah.
was there. You had like all of these leaders who are very opposed to each other, mind you, like very not friendly. Um, and I just was sitting there thinking about it, and I'm like, it's interesting that he had all of these imperialist countries, like heads of state, at his funeral. That's odd for a communist leader. That doesn't happen. You don't see, Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump, singing the praises of Stalin.
Well, it gets better because at the time of the Cuban Revolution, um, Tito's Yugoslavia, because the United States, especially trying to hedge their bets because they saw Fidel Castro was getting very, very popular, very, very powerful, was winning victories. There's a chance he might win. So the United States was holding back on sending weapons to Batista.
Okay.
Likewise, the British were adopting a similar stance. So who was it who supplied weapons to Batista to fight against Fidel Castro and the Cuban rebels? It was Yugoslavia and Israel.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
Hmm.
Why Yugoslavia? Why wouldn't they want Fidel and Che in power?
Because Tito, and this is the second point, at the time, there was something that has since, I don't know, just died with a whimper because no one talks about it anymore. It just kind of disappeared. But
Mm-hmm.
there was the so-called non-aligned movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you got the theory of three worlds, because the theory of three worlds, a lot of people just associate it with Mao Zedong, but no, it was started by the Indian Prime Minister Nehru.
Okay.
And in Nehru's view, the world was divided into three. The first world, which was the United States and the advanced capitalist countries of Western Europe.
Yep.
The second world was the Soviet Union and the so-called Eastern Bloc.
Mm-hmm.
But and then the third world was everybody else that the two camps, the first and second world, were fighting over.
I see.
So the non-aligned movement, the people who were supposedly, in fact, in every single case they were, but supposedly not aligned with the US, not aligned with the Soviet Union, and trying to be a third force
A
and
secret
play
third
the
thing.
other two off against each other. And Tito fancied himself a leader of the non-aligned movement.
That's interesting. That's very interesting, to say the least. And it's interesting that he would be sending weapons to Batista, a brutal dictator, mind y'all. Like, for anyone who doesn't know anything about the Cuban Revolution, which I should probably do an episode on Cuba at some point, they were living under a brutal regime under Batista. This came to an end. What is it? Mid 1950s, late 1950s.
You mean the triumph of the Cuban Revolution?
Yes,
59.
59. Yes.
New Year's Day, 59, 58, 59.
Nice. Yeah. Well, the perfect timing. Yeah, the Cuban revolutionaries, did regime change and, forced Batista out. Batista fled, and they established, I would say Castro was not necessarily a communist at the time, but Che Guevara was.
Oh, yeah. And Fidel's brother, Raul.
And Fidel,
There were,
yeah.
Yeah, there were about three. I mean, Castro himself, he himself denied being a communist. You can easily find public statements that he made. But he was certainly had some Marxist influence going back to his student days, and he certainly had three people very close to him that were communists. One was Che, the second was his brother Raúl, and the third was Camilo Cienfuegos.
And who's that?
Well, one of the main leaders of the Cuban Revolution who died very early on in a plane crash.
Oh, I see. Yeah, and see, he had a lot of influence from Marxists and everything. Che, I think, is very special in his, and what he was doing because, he was the kind of leader that wanted to start revolution everywhere.
Well, Che had, I think, the perfect evaluation of Fidel Castro. And I have to personally admit, I just told you my mother was a diehard Fidelista. But
yeah, Kamala's a drive-by Cuban.
Oh yeah. Ooh, I shouldn't have said that. Shouldn't have given that away. No. I'm Swedish.
Swedish.
But Che characterized Fidel in these words. I have always seen Fidel as an outstanding representative of the revolutionary bourgeoisie. Unquote.
And that's interesting, because I actually got a question recently from one of my labor talk sessions that I was doing, coming soon, for those who are listening, coming soon. At some point, I will be releasing another film. And I got a question about whether bourgeois people from the bourgeois class could be revolutionaries. And if they were the ones that actually had to start the revolution because working class people, quote, couldn't. And I said, well, of course, first of all, like bourgeois people, people who come from a higher strata can absolutely join in on the revolution. But no, it's not only organized by people who come from a higher class who have access to education. Lenin technically came from like a middle upper class family, and he himself went to like law school and everything. But then he became the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, but that also came after years of organizing and gaining credibility throughout the movement.
Yeah.
And I think that Che quote is really interesting. And it's not necessarily speaking down on Fidel Castro. It's being honest about where he came from and who he was prior to becoming a revolutionary, which he came from a rich landowning family.
He did. And I have nothing but respect and admiration for Fidel Castro. But as Enver said in some other capacity, we respect and admire him for what he was,
yes,
not for what we would want him to be.
Exactly. You're not going to find the perfect revolutionary. People are imperfect. And Enver, as it relates to Albania, bringing it back to our friends in Albania, why was Enver such a staunch anti-revisionist? He has a lot of writings on this, which folks can access at the Marxist International Archive or listen to them online. But why was he so anti-revisionist?
Yeah, that quote from Shakespeare: "Some people some people are born great, but others have greatness thrust upon them."
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Enver is a case in point of that. And if you read his writings, and it's really he has a remarkable body of work in
Mhm.
this respect, because towards the end of his life, his political diary was published
Okay.
and categorized according to theme. So
Hmm.
there's 2 volumes of reflections on China.
Okay.
There's a volume called The Khrushchevites, which is dealing with the post-World War II Soviet Union, and The Titoites, his dealings with Yugoslavia.
Hmm.
And like I said, it's really remarkable because you don't have that kind of body of self-reflective memoirs, really, just about from anybody. And it gives you an inside view as to what was happening in the post-World War II and especially the post-Stalin era.
Yeah.
And so Enver, he started off as just a communist because that's all there was. It was a communist movement. That's it. It's when he starts to see, and it was like a process of awakening because he's dealing with, now, Albania is socialist. Albania is part of the communist family. It's
Hmm.
part of the world communist movement, and he's meeting these people. He's meeting people from East Germany. He's meeting people from Romania, from Bulgaria, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary. And he gives you his impressions of them very honestly. Um, and some of them he says, oh, there's a great, wonderful meeting with this comrade, Dimitrov from Bulgaria. Dimitrov was fantastic. I was honored to meet him. But then he talks about some other people. It was like, well, I'm not too sure about some of the things that Gheorghiu Dej from Romania is saying. Now, he preceded, it was the guy before Ceausescu. I'm not quite sure some of the things that I'm hearing coming from him. And then definitely when he met Khrushchev and saw some of the things that were being said behind the scenes, I said, this doesn't jibe. This doesn't jibe, and we're getting contradictory views and we're getting contradictory information, and I'm seeing things that don't quite fit.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until then the big shock of the 20th Party Congress, where Khrushchev had defeated the pro-Stalin group, which was Molotov and Kaganovich and
Hmm.
Voroshilov, and now had assumed total preeminence and denounced Stalin.
Crazy move, by the
And
way.
yeah, and that's when the whole communist world was shaken.
Hmm.
And that's really where you see the beginnings of Soviet revisionism and the flip side, the beginnings of modern day anti-revisionism, because I think it needs to be said that revisionism has been a problem in Marxism going back to the end of the 19th century.
Right.
And we can talk about that if you want to. Um, and certainly Lenin fought against revisionism. But anti-revisionism, almost like as a subset, almost as a thing in and of itself, really comes from as a reaction to the 20th Party Congress.
Yeah.
Because now you're hearing from the mouth of, and this is why it was so shocking. And this is why even people like Enver was like, what? What are we hearing? What is this? This is why it was so shocking, because the world communist movement had, up until 1956, certainly was subjected to anti-communist propaganda, anti-communist slander. But now here you have, coming from the voice, coming from the mouth of the leader of the Soviet Union itself. Yeah, that was all true. Stalin was an evil guy.
Which is insane because for listeners who aren't too familiar with like the history of Stalin, um, he had just basically won World War II for like the
Hmm.
fucking world.
Hmm.
Him and the Red Army and the Soviets had lost so much. And had basically been the face of international communism for years. This was this was a lot of drama, to say the least. Like this was kind of crazy to do. And I'm sure Stalin would disagree with me and say, "Oh, I was not the face. There's no such thing." But as the party chair, the general secretary at the time for the many years that he had been, and the Soviet Union being like, the first place that revolution had been successfully implemented, Stalin was like the guy. So it's kind of insane to just go against everything that most people knew at the time and say, actually,
Mhm.
no, he was brutal, when there was no evidence saying that he actually was.
And Khrushchev had been, because then you get the whole condemnation of the cult of personality. Khrushchev was one of the biggest promoters of the cult of personality.
Hmm.
He was the one. It was Khrushchev who was really, more than anyone else, really praising Stalin to the skies, and Stalin, the greatest genius of all time, the leader of the world's proletariat, our wise and beloved. That was all coming from Khrushchev.
Yeah, he loves to blow smoke up people's, like, yeah.
Yeah, and there was an incident, which Molotov records in his memoirs. They were published in the early 90s, called Molotov Remembers. And he recalls an incident where sometime after the end of the war, there's some, I forget the details, but there's some public meeting, and Stalin was to speak at this public meeting, and Molotov introduced him.
Hmm.
And Molotov said, and now it is my honor to present Comrade Stalin, the leader of the toiling and oppressed peoples of the world, the greatest genius. And he basically introduces Stalin in terms of the cult of personality.
Right.
And so everyone applauds, yay, yay, yay. And Stalin comes up, delivers his speech. And then when the event is over and the delegates are kind of milling around and, I don't know, getting their coffee or their tea and getting ready to leave, Stalin calls Molotov over and says, Vyacheslav Mihailovich, waves him over. And Molotov comes over and Stalin says to him, Vyacheslav Mihailovich, how long have we known each other? And Molotov goes, 25, 30 years more. And Stalin says, 30 years. And after all that time, now I have to hear this shit from you too.
Oh my God, what a queen. I'm sorry, that's so funny. Queening out right now. That's so funny. And that's the
But
thing,
yeah, Khrushchev was one of the biggest promoters of the cult.
and Stalin, not to make this into another Stalin episode, I'm kind of his biggest fangirl. I'm sorry, and I shouldn't be. But like he was very much against that stuff. Stalin
Oh,
was
yes.
about his business, He was like,
Yes.
and he tried to resign up to upwards of what, 3 times, and they wouldn't let
Four.
him.
Four.
And they were like,
Four.
no, you need to stay and like continue to lead the movement, which I would say was somewhat, I argue, is a bit of a detriment to not allow for like new leadership to come in and actually like, learn from the old leadership. I think that it can become a problem when you rely on just one guy to like run things, because that guy is eventually going to die, and it doesn't matter how good he is. If he's dead now, then you don't have a leader anymore.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I would say that there was a bit to their detriment, but they didn't have, the benefit of hindsight at the time. But as it relates to Hoxha, he knew Stalin.
Yes.
He was Stalin hadn't died until many years after Hoxha had initially met him, correct?
Hoxha met him. I mean, Albania, Socialist Albania triumphs in 44.
Mm-hmm.
And sometime after that, I mean, after the war was over, Hoxha traveled to the Soviet Union and he did meet with Stalin. And Stalin dies in 53. So, well, a good, at least 5 years.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, what Hoxha is essentially, from what I understand about Hoxha's writings, and I should say I have not read enough of Hoxha to be able to like have a full breadth of knowledge on everything he's written, but I do know a solid amount, and I would say that like he's more defending the fact like the a lot of the actual revisionism which is happening to Stalin's legacy and like all that he did, and also to like Marxism-Leninism.
Yes, because it wasn't just criticizing Stalin.
Yeah, no, it wasn't.
What comes out of the 20th Party Congress and then extended in 1961 at the 21st Party Congress, which is where Albania broke with the Soviet Union. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't just criticizing Stalin, but it was undoing socialism.
Yes.
It was starting a process that, first of all, gave up the idea of world revolution in terms of peaceful coexistence.
Hmm.
Now, there was a concept of peaceful coexistence before that, but not the way Khrushchev did it. Peaceful coexistence was, the Soviet Union does not meddle in the internal affairs of other countries, and we won't mess with you. You don't mess with us. You don't mess with us. We won't mess with you. And we treat each other with respect internationally.
Right.
But for Khrushchev, peaceful coexistence meant basically caving into the U.S.
Yeah. Getting on your knees, buddy. Get on your knees for the
Yes,
empire.
and things like starting the process of putting the Soviet economy on a for-profit basis,
Yes. And that is,
which culminated in '67, which was after Khrushchev was already ousted, but still it was a process that started early on and culminates in '67, where Soviet industries are put on a for-profit basis. And of course, Khrushchev saying that the Soviet Union is no longer a proletarian dictatorship, it is a state of the whole people.
that's weird.
Yes.
That's weird. And what was Enver's read of all of this at the time when this was all going on?
In a word, huh? What?
What? What the
What?
fuck?
At first, they couldn't make out what was happening. And I really can't emphasize too much what it meant for the world communist movement to hear this coming from the mouth of the leader of the Soviet Union himself.
Hmm.
It created a crisis. Um, there's a wonderful Marxist historian, since passed away, Eric Hobsbawm, wrote quite a bit on, especially kind of the origins of the English working class. But he was a Marxist. He was part of the Communist Party of Great Britain. But he has a line somewhere where he says, the Russian Revolution created a world communist movement. Khrushchev's speech destroyed it.
Yeah.
And there's a truth there. And that's why I say that anti-revisionism as something beyond, because you could say that you're someone before 1956. Are you an anti-revisionist? Oh, yeah, because I'm a communist. So of course we're against revisionism.
Yeah.
Well, now we're talking something more.
Because revisionism at the time meant either you were a communist or you were a
Social
reformist,
democrat.
social
Yeah,
democrat.
yeah,
Now it could mean a million different things. You could be a
right.
social democrat, you could be a Maoist, you could be a Titoite, you could be a million different things. You could be a
Yes,
Trotskyite, which
yes.
unfortunately there are too many of in the United States.
So then what happened was, so revisionism has taken hold of the Soviet Union itself.
Hmm.
And there was you could read in Hoxha's memoirs, kind of at first, like, I don't want to believe this. I don't want to believe what I'm hearing.
Right.
We have to get some factual information here. What the hell is going on? And so he highlights different meetings with Khrushchev, different meetings with Soviet leaders, different meetings with leaders from all over the Eastern Bloc, until finally in 1961, a conference of 80 world communist parties, essentially. And by this time, already contradictions had begun to emerge between the Soviet Union and China.
Hmm.
So it was at this world meeting of 80 communist parties that Albania just blasted Khrushchev and blasted Khrushchevite revisionism. And China came to the defense of Albania.
Yeah. Well, because Mao had actually written after Stalin died about a glowing review of Stalin.
Mhm. Yeah. So what happened at that
Hmm.
meeting was you saw the world communist movement split.
Yep.
Uh, the majority of communist parties supported the Soviet Union and continued to support the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But you had a significant number break away and align with China and Albania. And that's really where modern anti-revisionism begins.
Right. Right. And it's when Hoxha and Hoxha and was this the Sino-Soviet split?
Yeah.
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 And I also think it's interesting to see what Cuba is doing at the time as well, because Che Guevara is also not too sure about uh, Khrushchev. He's
He out
not.
now calls Khrushchev a revisionist in a private letter that he wrote to one of his comrades in the Cuban revolutionary leadership, Armando Hart, where Che says something along the lines of because they were republishing some Soviet materials, and it was and in Cuba, translating to Spanish, publishing them in Cuba, and Che writes a letter to Armando Hart where he kind of sarcastically said, "And don't forget, we should include the great revisionists among them, including your friend Khrushchev."
And that's the funny part is it's funny because Cuba, Fidel wants to cozy up to Khrushchev because they have resources, which, if for those who don't know, at the time when Castro is successful in his revolution, or the proletarian Cuban revolution against the Bautista people and all what they're doing, the U.S. slaps a bunch of big old fat sanctions on them.
Yes.
And those are pretty bad. So they're looking desperately for a trading partner.
And the Soviets stepped in and agreed to purchase Cuban sugar when the United States had cut them off totally. When the United States had cut them off totally and pressured everybody else in the world to not purchase Cuban sugar.
Yes.
Well, the Cuban economy at that time was almost entirely based on sugar, so it was a death sentence against Cuba. And the
tourism.
Soviets saved the day.
Yeah,
for Cuba.
And it makes sense at the time why Castro wanted to partner with the Soviets, but I completely understand Che's feelings on the matter, and the fact that it is true that they were revisionists, and that this was not going to end well for them, at least. Cuba's still around, the Soviet Union unfortunately isn't, and they were illegally dissolved, but nevertheless. And so, one thing I've wanted to know more about is, what happened to communist Albania? Like, they're not really around anymore.
Well, what happened was, and there's some interesting, kind of murky behind the scenes things happening, because of course, Enver dies in 85. Around that same time, Konstantin, Brezhnev dies earlier in the 80s. He's succeeded, and I forget the order, whether it's Chernenko and then, oh God, was Andropov, or Andropov and then Chernenko. But basically, these guys were around just for months. And then Gorbachev comes to power.
Yes.
And he begins the whole process of glasnost and perestroika. Well, apparently, there was some negotiating behind the scenes. And we have evidence of meetings between the Albanian foreign ministry and the Cuban foreign ministry and the East German, the GDR foreign ministry, and issuing joint statements. And the Albanian foreign minister traveling to Cuba, meeting with Fidel Castro, and the Cubans sending a delegation to Albania. And it appeared, and they issued statements that they are, now get this, of course, considering where Albania is coming from, that there were, had unanimity of opinion on present day world affairs.
Okay.
Like I said, this gets murky.
Yeah,
and
that's interesting.
I want to say, but I say it with a big question mark at the end. Was this an attempt to create an anti-revisionist, anti-Gorbachev alliance?
Question mark?
Question mark, yeah. And so what happened was, Gorbachev basically gutted what was left of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union fell apart, and the Berlin Wall came down, and one by one, the different states of Eastern Europe had counter-revolutions, and Poland being the big one. But Albania was untouched by this for a while. But then, and again, this is murky. And I mean, and you and I have had conversations about
Hmm.
this,
Yeah.
about how people romanticize the CIA and they treat the
Yeah.
CIA almost like comic book villains. I think I said that people sometimes present you a version of the CIA that's like a combination of the Legion of Doom and the Illuminati and Spectre,
Yep. All of it rolled up into one.
all rolled into one. When in fact they bungle quite often.
They do.
But maybe there was something here, um, in the sense that I get a feeling that there was a sentiment in Washington that, hey, we're on a roll, get rid of all of them.
Hmm. Yep.
And so you started to see mass demonstrations, anti-government and anti-communist demonstrations appearing in Albania. This is like 91. So already the Soviet Union's gone.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a shakeup in the leadership. Basically, I think what the way I would view it, at least, is a failure of leadership and a failure of nerve at the center of the Albanian party, which at this time was being held by Ramiz Alia, who succeeded Enver as general secretary.
Hmm.
And basically, they just folded.
Yep. Kind of a quiet, a quiet end to what they had initially started in the 1940s.
But then what happened a few years down the line is when you had the final breakup of Yugoslavia and you had the Kosovo War, you saw rebellions and uprisings break out in Albania in favor of socialism.
Oh shit. Hello.
And NATO invaded.
Oh dear. Yep.
And it took NATO to finally put a period at the end of the life of Albanian socialism, or at least as it was in Enver's time.
Yeah. And I think that that's a really good segue into Albanian policy, which is the other thing I wanted to discuss in this episode, because we've looked at anti-revisionism and we've looked at kind of what was going on behind the scenes, who was exactly responsible for the revisionism to begin with, what revisionism is, and why Hoxha was so obviously against it. Again, listeners, not readers, listeners, please go back and actually read Hoxha's works on this, because I don't think we can do it enough justice on what he was actually talking about. Because, that's why we uphold him at the party level, because his writings on anti-revisionism are like nothing else that has existed prior to that.
No.
He was writing at a time that, like, when you listen to like Lenin talking about Kautsky, in his writings on Kautsky and everything, like that for the time was obviously very pertinent, because you had a lot of social democrats who were becoming reformists, which at the time they all considered themselves social democrats. You didn't have all of these different distinctions until a little bit later. But, Hoxha is writing at a time where we're seeing, obviously, like we talked about, a different kind of revisionism that is just as important to understand.
It was revisionism in power.
Yeah.
It was revisionism from the top,
Yeah.
because the Khrushchevite faction had seized control of the Soviet party apparatus.
Yes. And
And
they, oh, go ahead.
there's a whole history there. We can have go off on a tangent and have a whole discussion on that. But for our purposes, when we're talking about tonight, Albania is okay. So you had this revisionist coup in the Soviet Union, and now the revisionists are in control of the Soviet party. But they got to deal with the rest of the world communist movement, and a very interesting thing starts happening. Even while Stalin had not yet died, like in the last months before his death. And I hate conspiracy theories.
Yes.
But there's something going on.
Yeah.
Because you have between 1953 and 1961 what I call the Great Communist Die-Off, the Great Communist Extinction Event. Because in that, 53, a 7-year period, almost all the leaders of the world communist movement before that time either die or are removed from power.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
you saw people like Matyas Rákosi in Hungary removed from power. You saw Clement Gottwald in Czechoslovakia. Supposedly, he goes to Stalin's funeral and catches a cold and then dies when he comes back home of a cold.
Uh-oh.
Um, and you read the death dates for some of these people, and it's like, they died 1960, died 1959, died 1960, died 1961.
Hmm.
Like I said, I don't like conspiracy theories, but
It's
what are the
giving.
odds? What
Yeah,
do the statistics say?
it's giving. Yeah, and it's also the communist movement is still pretty young, all things considered. Marx was writing in like the 1860s, 1850s. You know, the Soviet Revolution, the Russian Revolution happens in 1917.
Right.
I think it's important for people to recognize the big picture here. Capitalist production and production in general, capitalist states, have had generations to develop. This is not
Centuries.
the centuries. This is not the
Yeah.
case with communists.
No.
The Soviet Union was the first go at like an actual communist state. They did not do everything right. And I have been very critical at times. Like I uphold Stalin. I'm still very critical of his policy on abortion. We
Mm.
talked about this in the last Enver Hoxha episode. I'm
Yeah.
still very critical of Stalin's stance on abortion, even though he wasn't anti-abortion. I still think that there was a lot of problems with that policy, but that doesn't mean that I don't uphold a lot of other things that Stalin said and did. Um,
Sure. And at that last, when we talked about Enver previously, you asked me, so you asked me, what do you think are mistakes that Enver made? And I told you, well,
yeah,
yeah, he was a human being.
yeah,
Wasn't a god, wasn't a prophet. He was a human being, and human being make mistakes.
exactly.
So
And
does that invalidate, because he made a mistake here or made a mistake there, does that invalidate his whole life work? No.
absolutely not.
But you
And
need
that's
to see things in context and in balance.
and that's kind of the point when we talk about these movements and why I think it's important to study them because when we look at revisionism and what they did, like for example, Tito. There was a lot of problems within Yugoslavia that culminated in the Civil War. Was it a civil war in the 90s? What
Yes.
is that?
Well,
Yeah.
to a certain extent, yes. In that the various once again, I don't want to, because I got to keep repeating this because as you yourself know, and your listeners do not, we've had a lot of talks,
Mhm.
and you know that I flinch at this conspiracy theories, but there are times you got to wonder. Um, because you saw happening in Yugoslavia the exact same thing that happened in the Soviet Union. So the
Yeah.
different component republics of Yugoslavia want to break off.
Yeah, and there was a lot of nationalist elements in a lot of these.
Oh yeah.
And this is ultimately, now it was not necessarily the Tito, the Tito regime and Tito himself that caused the Bosnian genocide. However, there were a lot of repressive policies that happened in Yugoslavia at the time against
Hmm.
Bosniaks. Is that what we call it? Is it Bosniaks or is it
Bosniaks, yes,
Bosniaks?
yes.
That eventually culminated in the genocide that happened to them in the 90s.
Well, there
Uh,
was a genocide against ethnic Albanians,
really?
the Kosovars, yeah, um, because there were laws that first of all, if you looked at the prison population in Tito's Yugoslavia, Albanians were almost overwhelmingly the majority of prisoners.
Yeah.
Now, of course, prisoners accused of common crimes, but certainly, we in the United States know all about that. When you have
Mm.
an entire population who's the majority of prisoners, what's going on here?
Yeah, no, we
What's
know
really
this very
going on here?
well.
So there was that, but there were also, they passed laws limiting Albanian families to how many children they could have.
They did the same thing to Bosnian families as well. They
Hmm.
did the one-child
Hmm.
policy to Bosnians.
Yep.
And it makes you wonder, how actually communist was Tito and all of his folks and everything, and the people that he upheld, because or that upheld him, because after he died, everything fell apart in Yugoslavia. And they had the civil war, and it ended up being was it the Serbs and the Croats were fighting They weren't
Yes,
fighting each other, were they? They
I
were.
believe they were. I believe they were.
They were.
Yeah.
And it became it became a very bloody civil war in which many Bosnians were unfortunately murdered. Um, and we have to look at this, in full context and understand that, like, yeah, no, that was pretty bad. And I forget what I was saying about, but basically, like, that the policies in which Tito had used were not necessarily trying to do genocide against Bosnians, but was definitely taking a side. And
Yeah.
because he was trying to bring together all of these different ethnic minorities and ethnic groups who had initially been fighting each other, um, and was like, okay, we are Yugoslavia. This is what we are. But when you have policies that are affecting only one group of people, and specifically Bosniaks were Muslim, I believe.
Yes. Bosniaks are majority Muslim, and Albanians. People often say Albania is a majority Muslim country, but yes, although maybe the more correct word is plurality, because you have three religions in Albania. You had Muslims, Catholics, and Orthodox, and it was Muslims who were there were more Muslims,
Hmm.
but it was divided them in three. So maybe plurality Muslim might be a more correct way to say it. But so yeah, that's true, and also they're not Slavs.
Yeah. And that made a big difference. And so, and when we're shifting over to Albania, when we're talking about this, there's a lot of policy in Albania that a lot of people criticize. Criticism is always a good thing, earnest criticism and good faith. And I would say one of the biggest things that people are critical of is the religion policy. We've talked about this before.
Hmm.
We have, but to go a little more into that policy, it was essentially saying that Albania was an atheist state, correct?
Yes, yes, yes. Well, the campaigns against religion. Well, first of all, religion in Albania, and I know that I just said that Albania was divided into sort of three faiths,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but religion was never a dominating factor in Albania.
Hmm.
Not the way it was it wasn't and still is in other countries. Like, for example, just to move totally out of the Balkans, like in Ireland, like Irish nationalism is almost tied with Catholicism.
That's true.
Why? Because it's a reaction against uh, Britain and imposing Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
So in Albania, you had Islam basically imposed by the Ottomans when Albania fell to the Ottoman Empire after the collapse of, Byzantium.
Yeah.
But it was never a major, major, major divisive factor in Albania. Now, you did have situations like, and even Enver personally intervened in one of these, where you had almost like soap opera-ish situations where a boy from a Catholic family wants to get married to a girl from a Muslim family, and the family's prohibited, that kind of
Oh
stuff.
no.
Oh, um,
How
and,
dare
and
they?
the thing with where Enver comes in is that there was a situation like that, and the two lovers decided to say to hell with their families, and they were going to get married. And Enver wrote a letter, actually, to both sets of parents, saying you must be very proud to have reared children who are independent
Or
and are not tied to the superstitions of the past. Something like
yes.
that. And of course, he supported them. But so back on track here. So religion was never that powerful in Albania, and the proverb that was repeated by many people was, and even Enver himself mentioned it on occasion: the religion of Albanians is Albania.
Yeah.
And I myself have had an ethnic Albanian joke with me and say, "Do you know what you call an Albanian Muslim?"
What?
What? He's an atheist.
That's off. That's very good. That's good. That's good. No,
So religion was never that powerful. Um, so in 1967, at the same time as the Chinese Cultural Revolution, there was an Albanian Cultural Revolution.
hmm.
And the Albanian Cultural Revolution was more of an actual cultural revolution. It was, as opposed to the sort of chaotic faction fighting that erupted in China, it really was an attempt by the party to create a genuine socialist proletarian culture in Albania and to remove vestiges of the past, to really enforce women's rights and gender equality. That's where you have the famous quote from Hoxha, that the entire party and nation should break the necks and throw into the fire anyone who tramples on women's rights. And that was a part of it, wiping away, clearing the slate of old, backward ideas. And religion was part of it, was seen as part of it.
Yeah, and I think that it's important, I think, to talk about their policy on religion, because there's a lot of people who I would say, and in some cases maybe rightfully, I'm not like, I don't have like a deep understanding or knowledge of exactly what happened. I have not read, I have not done that research, but what I do understand is there is some discourse around whether it was oppressive or not to what they were doing. And there is talk out within the communist bubble or sphere, that what they were doing was specifically targeting Muslims. It does bring into context more that the fact is that there was, as you said, just a plurality of Muslim people, or people who practice Islam in Albania. So this just happened to be the majority of people who were affected by this policy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were actually trying to target Muslims because they were Muslim.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Hoxha himself came. I even had one person, because I know exactly what you're talking about. I had one person say to me that Hoxha committed genocide against Albanian Muslims.
Oh God.
For Christ's sake, Hoxha was from a Muslim family himself.
Yes.
His and there's a whole story here, which maybe we can get into because he later fell from grace. But his right-hand man and closest associate for many years, kind of second in command, was Mehmet Shehu. Well, let me draw your attention to that first name, Mehmet.
That is.
Muhammad.
Yep.
Mohammed. That's the Turkish for Mohammed. And Enver means an Enver is a teacher. Turkish, of course, Ottoman Islamic, but an Islamic teacher is an Enver. So you have genocide against Muslims led by a guy who's named for a Muslim teacher and another guy named Muhammad.
Yeah.
Not quite. Yeah, not quite. If anything, if there was a particular religion that was specifically targeted in the anti-religion campaigns, it wasn't Islam. It was Catholicism. It was the Catholic Church.
And
the Catholic Church was seen as, and it is, not just a religion, but a political force, and a political force that supported fascism during the war.
I did want to mention that, actually. Part of the reason that is that was the case, that they were targeting Catholics, or Catholicism more specifically, is because the Catholic Church had played an active role in supporting Mussolini during the war.
Yeah.
So they had I mean, here's the thing: communists are the ultimate anti-fascists. And like, I think that it's perfectly fine at the time, especially at the time that they were doing this. The World War II had only happened, but what, 20 years prior to when this policy was being implemented?
Yes.
It was still fresh in most people's minds what had happened during World War II, whose side people were on. And it was still very fresh in people's minds that the Catholic Church had taken a side, and their side was the fascists.
Well, the anti-religious campaign can be summarized in just a couple of sentences from the Albanian constitution itself, because they drafted a new constitution in 1976, and it was ratified, and that constitution specifically said, and I'm almost quoting, I wish I'd had notes in front of me, and I don't want to leave my screen here to look it up. I might drop out of the call.
Yeah.
But it was something along the lines of, the state acknowledges no religion and reserves the right to promote the materialist scientific worldview among the people. There you have
Right.
it. That's it.
And interestingly, I want to point out that this was not saying that individuals could not privately practice their religion
No.
or have their own religious circles in which people practice together. It was simply saying that the governing body, which represents the proletariat, will not recognize a religion and will promote what we know to be true, which is the materialist perspective and scientific perspective, more importantly, because science is what has gotten us to where we are. And this isn't to say that religion hasn't played an extremely important role in human history. It absolutely has. But it's more making the argument that religion should not be a dominating or dictating force within political life.
It was a blow against the political power of religion, especially the Catholic Church.
Uh-huh.
But also the social power, the reactionary social power. Because, as you know, Albania before 1944 was an extremely patriarchic society.
Yes.
And that was buttressed by the church.
Yeah, and I also want to kind of circle back to the fact that the Albanian Revolution was very grassroots and, as you said, very like indigenous in nature to the people who had lived there for many, many years, of course. So that means it was a very bottom-up revolution. This came from the people. This wasn't something that was necessarily imposed, but this was very much from the people who were living in Albania. So there was a significant portion of people who had grown up in a very religious home who actively chose to participate in a communist movement.
Yes. And the anti-religion, maybe I shouldn't even call it that. But the campaign against the power of religion was actually spearheaded and initiated by the communist youth.
Really?
Yes.
Shameless plug, join Red Youth Rising, folks. If you're between the ages of 14 and 30, you can
Yes,
join.
do the same here. Do the same here. Join RYR.
Yes, join RYR. We have just started kicking off. It was my day to answer emails. So
Ah.
if you're emailing, we'll answer.
But yeah, I mean, it wasn't a question. And there were things also that sometimes people will say that that they forced people men to shave their beards. And who had beards? Muslim imams had beards. Well, you know what? Orthodox priests have beards too.
Yeah.
um, the stories are conflicting. A lot of it is hearsay. Because yeah, Muslim imams had beards, Orthodox priests had beards, Marx, Engels, and Lenin had beards too.
So yeah,
I don't think there was a problem with beards.
Stalin had a mustache, guys.
Stalin had a huge mustache.
Very good
uh,
mustache.
yes, yes. But I think that what was going on, and maybe it's entirely possible that some people got hot-headed and got a little carried away, dizzy with success, as Stalin would have phrased it, and kind of overdid it. But no, it was not a question of private belief. You want to believe in Islam, you want to believe in the Pope, you want to believe in Martin Luther, you want to believe in Cthulhu and
I
the
personally
flying
do believe in
spaghetti monster.
Cthulhu.
I mean, I go for Zeus. I mean, you know me.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Uh, it's a question of political power and the
Right.
social power of these institutions that are enforcing reactionary policies, and sometimes at the behest of foreign imperialists, because there were fundamentalist churches in the United States, and we all know where their political alignment is, who are smuggling Bibles into Albania.
Right. And again, this is not saying that people were not able to read the Bible in Albania. This is, I'm sure on the American side, people were saying this and being like, oh my God, they don't have freedom of religion? How terrible. And it's more of saying, no, dumbass, they just don't force people. Like, here's the thing. Americans' ideas of what an actual like secular state is so warped, because I don't think that ever actually was the case here in the United States. And Americans, being one myself, often I feel have a very overinflated ego on how America is a pioneer of so many different ideas of freedom and liberty and blah 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 blah. When we look at communist regimes and communist movements and what they were actually doing and how they were forcing things, of course, we can look at movements like the Tito movement and Tito and say like, okay, there were definitely some fucked up things happening over here. We can also look at like what was going on in Albania and say that like, actually, no, that was a solid policy. Like they were right. Because in the United States, as it pertains to religion, we basically have a religious cult running our government right now.
Indeed.
Are we free? Are we free now? Are we free yet? Like I'm kind of tired of hearing this whole like, because a lot of Americans want to compare what was going on in communist countries to the conditions of Americans, not really thinking about the fact that maybe the conditions of Americans were just really fucking bad.
We're all taught in grade school how the Pilgrims came over because they wanted religious freedom. Well, that's only partially true. Yeah, the Puritans came over because they wanted the religious freedom to establish a theocracy and oppress other religious groups.
and have slaves.
Yes, and they
Yeah.
were, they were hanging Baptists and Quakers.
Yeah, we don't come from some kind of like glorious like movement for liberal ideals of freedom. Like we come from a very, as many civilizations do, from a very violent history of like oppression. And Americans seem to think that many Americans and American sympathizers seem to think that this is not the case, and that things like the American Revolution didn't have any drawbacks, or there weren't any people who were actually suffering at the hands of Americans. There's a lot of denial, for example, around the Native American genocide. And it's like, and the genocidal policies that our country upheld, which also happened to very much inspire Hitler and his whole movement.
Yes,
You ever heard of him?
yes. Oh
Like,
yeah, yeah.
I know you have. I know you have, Carmen. And I'm not so
Yeah,
sure about.
it rings a bell. It does
It
ring a
rings a
bell.
bell.
But during the Nuremberg trials, and now Nuremberg is all in the media because of the film, which I haven't seen, by the way, and I want to go see it.
I haven't either.
But during the Nuremberg trials, the guy who was the former head of the Hitler Youth and later governor of Austria, Nazi governor of Austria, Baldur von Schirach, during the trial, he was I think it was the American prosecutor was grilling him and said, "So did reading Hitler and Mein Kampf turn you into an anti-Semite?" And von Schirach said, "No, no, reading Henry Ford did that for me."
Yeah, no, I will never ever stop making this point. Henry Ford and plenty of other American capitalists were very cozy with Adolf Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
Very cozy with him. You know who wasn't? Stalin.
Ah.
Boom. Sorry, I'm gonna put that out there because I think it's like, because I've heard from like I was talking to my mom about this actually recently, and we were talking about, she brought up, she was like, well, they made a pact with the Nazis, and I'm like, you mean the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact? You mean the one that immediately fell through because the Nazis were going to invade them anyway? Like, okay, if you really want to make that argument, fine. But let's look at it in context and look at all of the other Western states who had very cozy relations with the Nazis for years, when the Soviets were trying to get them to, come to their side so they could actually, fight the fascists. So first of all, that just does not hold up at all, because Molotov knew that, and so did Stalin, that they were going to invade. Everyone fucking knew. It's not, you don't spout hateful rhetoric about how you want to enslave all of the Slavic people and not go and invade them.
Well, the thing about the non-aggression pact is, as you said, you often have people throw that up and say, well, Hitler and Stalin, they were allies because they had a pact. Well, you know what? There was also the German-British Naval Pact. There was a German-Turkish pact. There was a German-Lithuanian pact. There was a German-Estonian pact. There was a German agreement with France. There was a German, um, most famously, a concordat, an agreement with the Pope, with the Church, with the Vatican. So were they all planning to divide the world up?
And also, the last ones to do a pact with them were the Soviets. Because they realized that, like, oh shit, no one else is actually going to come to our support.
No.
Well, fuck
No.
us, I guess.
And it becomes hypocritical because then when the British, the Turks, the Catholic Church, whatever, they signed an agreement with Nazi Germany. Okay, they were just diplomatically looking after their interests.
Right.
Okay, that's fair. But the Soviets weren't.
Yeah. No, the Soviets were fighting for their life,
Yeah.
casually, just fighting for their lives, and it's like,
Well, I mean, for 10 years, they had been running all over Europe trying to form what they called collective security
yeah,
against Nazi Germany. And you had Litvinov, who was the Soviet foreign minister at the time, going to Paris, going to London, going to Geneva, to Switzerland in front of the League of Nations, and basically saying collective security is the way. If we all stand together, we can box him in and let him stew in his own juices.
yep,
And no one wanted to hear it. And at the time of Munich, the Soviet Union announced, our troops are ready to march right now. Just give us the word. But we can't do it alone. We need the French to come in from the other side. And we're ready to march against Germany now, 1938.
mm-hmm.
And of course, Neville Chamberlain and Daladier, no, thank you, we're not interested. Well, after 10 years of trying to form a real anti-fascist alliance, they got the door slammed in their face.
Yep.
And so eventually decided, all right, to put it bluntly, fuck you all. We'll take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
And give us a chance to prepare for what we know is coming.
Yeah. And because, again, I think it's important for people to realize you don't make speeches and write things and plan to enslave an entire ethnic group of people to build your Aryan race utopia, and not actually invade them to do that, to make that plan happen. That's what Hitler wanted to do.
Hitler had been writing this and speaking on this as early as the 1920s.
Yeah. And it kind of,
I think he even put it. I think he even wrote it in Mein Kampf itself that the future of Germany lies in expanding to the east. Well, what's east of Germany?
yeah, no, and taking it back to our boy Hoxha in Albania, this is why we are anti-revisionist, because it was Stalin, not specifically Stalin as just the guy, but him, the government that he led, the people who and most importantly, the working people who, lived in the Soviet Union, um, and were working collectively to build up a socialist state, and communism, who defeated the Nazis. They were the backbone of that war. And if it had not been for, oh, go ahead,
No, go
Conrad.
ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
I'm just saying, if it had not been for them, we would all be speaking German right now.
The world communist movement came out of World War II not only tremendously powerful, because if you look with the addition of China, of course, that's 5 years and 4 years afterwards, 1949. But see it as part of the bigger picture. End of World War II, socialism covers what, 1/4, 1/3 of the whole surface of the globe.
Mm-hmm.
But in addition to that, communism and the communist movement comes out of the war with a huge amount of prestige because people saw that the communists were the most determined fighters against fascism.
Absolutely.
That's why the French Communist Party was so powerful, but that's why the Italian Communist Party were so powerful. Who were the anti-fascist partisans, by and large, in Italy? The communists. Who was the underground resistance movement in France? By and large, the communists.
And it's why the
And
fascists.
that's why you had intellectuals and cultural figures like Pablo Picasso joining the French Communist Party. And then why did you join the French Communist Party? Because they were the ones who fought hardest against fascism.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize, that poem that is overused so much by Zionists now, it's like first they came for blah, 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 and I didn't say anything. Well, the
Mm.
first line in that is first they came for the communists.
Yes.
And there's a reason.
Yes.
And it's exactly what you just said, Comrade. It's the fact that the communists were the hardest fighters against fascism because we are their ideological opposite. You have like the fascists have really no concrete ideology. They are essentially just they are the like embodiment of reaction.
Yes.
Communists, we are methodical, we are scientific. We have a very fleshed out, informed worldview, and an actual plan. You know, this is not the case with fascists. We
No,
can
no,
see,
it's not. And that's why it's always been a problem to really define what fascism is. Now, of course, we have the famous Comintern definition of fascism as the open uh, dictatorship of the open terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of finance capital. And that is true.
yeah,
But that doesn't explain. I mean, yeah, that'll explain why industrialists like the Krupps and the Siemens and the Tysons bankrolled Hitler, but that doesn't explain why Hans Schmidt down the street put on a brown shirt.
yeah. No, it doesn't. And it's, it's why do people pick up and decide to support fascist movements? It's because their material conditions, at the bottom line, their material conditions are bad enough that they are willing to join any movement that is saying we can change that for you for the better.
Yes.
Now, fascists will say we can change that for you. Go and put on this brown shirt and let's go attack some ethnic minorities.
Right.
Communists, on the other hand, will say, we agree with you, material conditions are bad. Let's punch up to the class that is actually causing this and come in arms with many other groups, minorities, religions, XYZ. I say religions more as like, they're
Yeah.
but not on a religious basis. But let's pair up with all of these people because we all have one thing in common: labor. And takes it on that line, which of course is progressive and is actually getting at the root cause of the problem. Fascists can't do that, and it is because they are the like the concentration of capital gone mad, essentially unable to continue to control its violence against the proletariat, because the proletariat is like, hey, what the fuck are you guys doing? This is what capitalism has to eventually devolve into to maintain itself.
Well, that's why
And
I said it's so hard to really define what fascism is in favor of.
yeah,
Now, if you take the time, and a lot of people have, and say, okay, so let's look at these fascist movements. What do they all have in common? So can we come up with a typology, like almost like looking at a disease? What are the symptoms? And we can begin to define fascism that way. Okay, so it has these qualities, that characteristic. But if you sort of ask yourself, okay, so what is fascism for? You end up almost hitting a brick wall, because the fact is it's a contradictory movement, it's an irrational movement, and above everything else, as you said, it's a reactionary movement. It's easier to say what fascism is against than what fascism is for.
and that's because I think that fascism really isn't for anything other than capital. Um, because fascism, I maintain that fascism is capital and decay, mainly because what I think it is across the board trying to do is maintain capital's interests. We can see with those who were funding Nazi Germany, I would say a large reason was because many states at the time also wanted to like have a joint block against the communists.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't
Yes.
until they realized how brutal the Nazis were that they were like, oh shit, we actually can't do that. Like that might be the worst option. But make no mistake, the United States, I think it's interesting when I confront liberals on this, when I talk about regime change and how the United States has participated in so many of these. And they always say, well, the United States isn't the only one. The United States, blah, blah, blah. At least, we're not the worst. And I'm like, yeah, but somehow we're always the ones who are implementing right-wing figureheads who tend to do some of the worst atrocities known to man. It's interesting, isn't it?
And telling, yes.
And telling. But
Yeah.
we got way off the rails with Enver. But either way, he would be proud of us.
Well, you know what? I got the perfect thing to bring us back, especially
Right.
considering what we were saying earlier. Because in that same 1976 Constitution, where it says the state recognizes no religion and promotes the scientific materialist worldview, there's also another clause in that Constitution that says Albania prohibits the establishment of fascist, nationalist, racist, and religious institutions and organizations.
Fair enough. And I think that I agree with that, because we can see time and time again religious groups which have these extremely right-wing reactionary, like militant arms to themselves. For example, what I think about is, white supremacist Christian nationalists here in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan, you have the one percenters, the three percenters, which I don't think they understand how math works, low key.
Probably not.
But you have those guys, but you also have, for example, I think of like ISIS and Al Qaeda.
Yeah. Yeah.
Both practice Islam, and both are militant arms of a religious organization, who carry out their own versions of that. And again, this is not to say that all people in Islam believe this. They absolutely do not. And it's the same with Christians and Catholics. More Christians. They don't. Not every Christian is out here agreeing with what the one percenters are saying in the Klan and everything. It just happens to be that they are taking on that religion as like the cornerstone of their reactionary right-wing militant action. But I can understand why Albania took that line. Thoughts?
Thing that you often hear, which kind of comes out of this same period, and I was wondering if you were going to bring this up, is sometimes you'll hear people on the left accusing Enver of being a racist.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, because he criticized Mao Zedong, and therefore that makes him a racist. And I've heard people say, well, he only criticizes communists of color. No, he didn't. No, he didn't.
What did he say about Mao?
Well, no, just criticizing Mao. That's all. Just criticizing Mao's policies. That's it. Certainly, he wasn't a racist. But Albania hosted and provided sanctuary for the PLO in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s.
For those unaware, that's the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Yeah. They supported and championed Palestine in the United Nations.
They absolutely did.
They supported the Black Panthers.
Period.
In the United States, and in fact, they received delegations. They were very, very close with communist movements throughout Africa and Asia, and supported them. And they supported Vietnam. And this story, I'm sure, that Enver Hoxha and Ho Chi Minh used to be roommates in Paris.
They were. Ho Chi Minh also. Ho Chi Minh also worked at the same bakery that Malcolm X would end up working at in New York.
Now that I didn't know. I did not know that.
In Harlem. Yeah, they worked at the same one. Different times, of course, but they did.
But you will hear, especially some more extreme Maoists will say, well, he was a racist. And they give absolutely no proof, no substantive proof. And the proof is overwhelmingly in the other direction. But one of the things, and this gets a little funny, because one of the things that they will say is that Enver wrote, I don't recall if it was a speech he made or an article he wrote, I believe it was a speech, where he talked about Western cultural values. And he said something along the lines of, um, uh, uh, and you see people running around with pants or no pants, and they're screaming jungle music.
They are.
And people immediately said, "Oh, it's racist because he's talking about jazz, the screaming jungle music." And my response to that has always been to say, you know what, that reveals your racism, because that is the first thing that you came to, isn't it?
Yeah.
You drew that conclusion that he's talking about jazz. In fact, he was not. Enver encouraged jazz troops to come to Albania. As a matter of fact, he wrote an article where there was a jazz troupe that was performing in Albania, and some local party officials were criticizing them, and Enver kind of smacked their wrists and say, "Don't be so narrow-minded. Don't be so narrow-minded, and be more respectful of other cultures and other peoples and their cultural forms." So he encouraged it. Um, what he was talking, and the date is crucial here. That speech or article was in 1974. Running around with pants or no pants, screaming jungle music. He wasn't talking about jazz. He was talking about Woodstock.
He was about to say, was he talking about the hippies?
Yes.
That's awesome.
It was a speech against what he felt were corrupting Western influences. And it's interesting, considering something else I'm going to tell you in a second, but corrupting Western influences. And it was, yeah, he was talking about the hippie movement. He was talking about the counterculture. And now you could criticize him for that and say, okay, well, he was a little narrow-minded, he was a little square. But, I hasten to remind everyone that, let's remember a guy born in Albania in 1908 is going to have a problem with Woodstock regardless.
I was about to say,
what
I
his
think
politics are.
the hippies were also like, this is yeah, no, I here's the thing, maybe he was a square, but he certainly was not a racist. That's, I just think that's funny more than anything, that he was basically just being a boomer. Like, he's just like, these kids, with their music and their no pants. Like, that's just like, okay, like, I
Yeah,
don't
well,
think.
yeah. I mean, 1974. Yeah, well, you're talking about jazz that originated in the 20s and the 30s and even earlier. No, 1974. What was happening in 1974?
Yeah, like, come on, guys, use your critical thinking skills a little bit here. The dude was talking about something completely different. Um, and
But
also,
then,
oh, go ahead,
but
yeah.
then, um, punk bands were allowed to perform in Albania
Oh, well, okay. What?
because
Please.
there is a British punk rocker, and I always jokingly refer to him as the Hojaist punker, who goes under the stage name of Attila the Stockbroker. And he toured Albania in the early
Oh,
80s, and he even has a song about it. And actually, he had several songs about Albania and his experiences there, some of them humorous, some of them more serious. But the fact is, he performed in Albania.
yeah. Well, that's cool.
So maybe once again, it's a question of what was the political and social content of these cultural or religious forms that were frowned upon.
Yeah, no, and that's like, that's the most important part, is context is extremely important in understanding um situations like this. And I think that it's incredibly important in understanding, because I mean, the thing about being a communist now is, context is everything, because of all of the anti-communism that is spewed by, ignorant liberals and people who have more malicious intent. um it's constantly an uphill battle. And more often than not, what I have faced in arguments and disagreements with people who are ideologically very opposed to Marxism, or ideologically very opposed to Marxism, is often what they are talking about is completely devoid of context, or it's just flat out wrong, because once again, they don't know the context.
Yeah.
I often hear this the most about Stalin, of course, but I also hear the same thing about, Lenin, Marx, the big one that my own dad even, says is, a Marxist didn't want to work. Marxist didn't want to have a job. That's why he wrote Capital. Like, okay, man, whatever.
Yeah. This was kind of part of the same process that you see with and again, I don't want to call it this, but it's the only words that are coming to my lips, the anti-religion campaign.
Yeah.
It was a cultural revolution. It was an attempt to proletarianize Albanian culture and establish it on a firm socialist foundation. And that had to do not just with religion and not just with screaming jungle music, but with the marriage laws, with family relationships, with the position of women in Albania. It was all part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it's important, we're wrapping up this segment, but I think that like what we're talking about here with Albania and their policy is to give more light and context to understanding why we uphold Hoxha, why he was such an important leader and figure in the movement, especially at the time that he was living and writing. Because we did have all of these different groups that were popping up, and we need to understand, parse through them, and say, okay, what was the good, what was the bad,
Yeah.
and really understand them at a very core level, because this is how we build a new, better movement.
There's a lot of dishonesty out there. Um, and I come to expect dishonesty from the right. That's just par for the course as far as I'm
That's just
concerned.
how
But
they
when I see
work.
it coming from, but when I see it coming from the left, then it upsets me.
Right.
These are the people whom I'm counting on to know better, at the very least, to know better. For example, um, you'll sometimes hear people say, well, Enver Hoxha called Che Guevara an anarchist. Okay. Well, let's look
Okay.
at the context of that. It was, he received a delegation from Latin American communist parties uh, in Albania, and it was right after the death of Che Guevara. And what Enver said was he was undoubtedly a very brave man, but his policy was an anarchist one. And he was criticizing the FOCO theory, not Che Guevara personally.
Yeah.
And
And
then on top of that, Enver, and this is the crucial point, because he just said, yes, he was undoubtedly a very brave man, but that's not what we need to be doing. These are the Foucault theories is anarchistic. But then he stops himself and he says, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. You Latin American comrades knew him better than I did.
but yeah, no, that's important.
Yeah,
And it's also, I do think that criticism of Che is valid, because I think
it
that
is.
Che,
It's,
like, one of my biggest criticisms of him is he was trying to do too much too quickly. Um, and I think that he was still an extremely successful revolutionary regardless. But I think that Che had some flaws in his reasoning and his planning around um, revolution. And, I think Fidel Castro had talked about it best, not necessarily with Che, but saying, he talking on, you know, the initial, Cuban, like when the Cuban Revolution started, and what, him and his forces. And he's like, I would rather have, if I could do it again, I would have rather had 15 men who were diehard about the movement than 100 who were kind of so-so on it.
yeah. Well, the ultimate proof is in what happened to Che himself.
Hmm.
I think, and this could be a whole other topic if you want one day.
Sure.
Che, maybe his biggest mistake was not following his own advice because he wrote his famous book, Guerrilla Warfare, and then he followed it up with an article a couple of years later called Guerrilla Warfare, a Method. But in guerrilla warfare, he states guerrilla warfare will only work under certain specific conditions. And top of the list is where the government and the state has absolutely no legitimacy amongst the people.
All right.
And what happened in Bolivia was the Bolivian government, just a year or two before, had inaugurated a land reform program. And people were mistakenly saying, okay, we're getting it. Hey, the government is listening to us. Things are improving. Let's give them a chance. And he also, when it was found out that he was in the country, because Bolivia, the geography and the economy of Bolivia is divided into two extremely contradictory and separate categories. You have the altiplano, the uh, the high plains area up in the Andes, which is basically mining, is the main industry, and then you have the lowlands, which are sort of like your typical Latin American, peasant economy. Well, when it was found out that that Che was in Bolivia, when the cat was finally out of the bag, the miners almost overwhelmingly voted to support him. But he based himself among the peasantry.
Oh dear.
Who had just gotten land reform and weren't about to risk it for some Argentine Cuban whom they don't know from Adam telling them you got to fight me.
Right.
Fatal mistake. Fatal mistake and not listening to his own advice.
Yeah, and that's, it happens, unfortunately. And I think that, what we can do is we can look at that and say, he made a fatal mistake, but we can learn from that and move beyond it. And I think it's the same with Hoxha and all of the things that he did, good, bad, mid, and understanding his writings. Again, I will push this. Read what Enver had to say. Actually read him, because a lot of it is very profound.
A lot of it is very profound, and a lot of it is very entertaining too.
Yeah. If there's one thing that because I was just telling Camilo, actually, comrades, I was telling Camilo that I had just finished Capital before we started
and I
filming.
saluted you. I salute you for that. That is an achievement.
But one thing I note before we end this call, one thing I wanted to note about this is what the thing about philosophers and people writing on these topics is they love the drama. They live for the drama.
Yes.
And I could not get over the fact that Marx he would be writing something so profound and interesting, and then he'd be saying, and this fucking idiot over yonder.
You get the same thing with Enver, because he'll be describing some meeting with some Eastern European party leader, and he'll go, well, that guy's a total jerk. Or he describes a meeting with Khrushchev. All right, here's a specific instance where Khrushchev is having a private conversation. They go for a walk in the Kremlin gardens, or the gardens in the back of the Kremlin, which he had planted with cabbages. And Khrushchev had like a walking stick, a cane with him. And he's talking to Enver. And as they're walking, he's like whacking the heads. Khrushchev is whacking the heads off cabbages right and left. And Enver commented, and while he was doing that, he splattered mud all over my new pants.
Oh my God.
You end up with the impression of, so what upset Enver more? The fact that Khrushchev was destroying state property or ruined his pants?
It's anyone's guess at that point.
Yeah. Well, yes, I mean, you find that's why I say read Hoxha's writings. I mean, if you want to know what the man was all about,
yeah,
you want to see, like I said, a really remarkable insider's view of how the process of how revisionism took root in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. He was an eyewitness, but he also was a pretty good writer and damn fun to read too.
Absolutely, and with that, listen to Comrade Camilo, everyone. Read Enver Hoxha. This is not the end all be all of course of his works and everything, and talking about him. Continue the conversation in the comments. And thank you so much, Camilo, for coming on tonight.
Oh, I'm glad to be here again. And hey, we could even have a third.
We could do a third. We could.
Oh yeah, there's lots there.
I'm up for it, is the thing. But thank you so much, Comrade. This was amazing.
Absolutely, my pleasure.